I'm Kyle Malnati, your host of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. At Calibrate, we exist to help people create generational wealth through real estate. My personal mission is to encourage, empower, and educate you by sharing best practices from business leaders that are proven winners. Broadcasting from the Mile High City, thank you for tuning in to the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast, hosted by yours truly, Kyle Malnati. My esteemed guest today, Peter Katz. Peter and I have met in person. He's also here in Denver, so it's always nice to have a neighbor on the show. Peter, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, you are welcome, and we're gonna have a great, engaging discussion about property management. Peter is the president of Denver Residential Services and Denver Commercial Management. Just a quick kind of behind the scenes of what that means. They operate, manage 50 properties, 250 residential units and counting, and 500,000 square feet of commercial space and counting. So it's going to be a great discussion about both multifamily and commercial real estate management. Peter, I think the first thing that I want to chat through with you is a question that's on a lot of people's minds is, maybe someone has a stigma around hiring a property manager. Maybe they think it's too expensive, or maybe they think the management company is never going to manage the property like I do as the owner. And so let's say if someone's interviewing a property manager and maybe they're skeptical, what are 3 or 4 things that you would hope that a would-be prospect that's interviewing you for management services might ask you so that you can have a good conversation that sets the right type of expectations?
Absolutely. I think getting comfortable with a manager is important. So interviewing them, meeting them, and learning their focus, their expertise. It's not just about fixing leaks and toilets. There's a whole lot more that goes into it. And as much as asking the manager questions, you should hear what the manager, defining your key. Those are the types of questions you should hear from your manager. Someone that just plugs and plays may not really manage the asset to what you are looking for. So if your manager is asking you, what's your, how long are you going to hold this property? Are you just looking for cash flow? If you're maximizing the cash flow, are you interested in asset preservation? Those are the questions that I'm going to ask my clients or potential clients. And I find that, you learn a lot about them and their goals, and then you can also manage to their expectations better. So defining, their hold period, their goals for the asset, and, what kind of owner they are is going to help us manage better for them and help the owner understand, our approach.
That's great advice. And then it leads into my next question, which is naturally, there's probably some mistakes that investors make as they enter into a management agreement. And because real estate investors are hard charging individuals, they've accomplished a lot because they've been in the marketplace and succeeded enough to buy $1 million or more dollar asset. And so what ends up happening is I think all of a sudden a management relationship doesn't work out the way that someone expects. And I think part of it could be unmet expectations that are maybe unrealistic. And so what are some of the things that you see that real estate investors might do that are maybe mistakes when engaging a management company? What I'm talking about is not spending enough in a certain area, whether it be the aesthetic of the property or doing routine maintenance turns. I mean, what are some of the things that you see that operators sort of resist? And you're like, if I could only just share with you how important this is, what are some of those common mistakes that investors might make when they're engaging a management company?
Well, I think that visiting the asset with the manager is really important, getting their eyes, understanding what the manager's seeing when they're out there. If you go to a property and it has, bad landscaping and, maybe neglected exteriors, if the manager doesn't see that and bring it to your attention, then you may have an expectation that those are just going to get fixed as part of the management. But managers aren't going to go do that unless an owner is willing to invest. And, just by walking the property, discussing the issues that the manager sees, what the owner's expecting or wanting as maybe beautification or improvements, or just exterior repairs, that's really a good way to set the expectations. And just the aesthetic of the property is only one small piece. There's the maintenance management, the accounting, the reporting, and tenant interaction. And so by having those discussions early on, setting expectations, understanding what the manager, how the manager approaches projects, then you'll be in better shape moving down the line.
That's all great advice. And it reminds me of several conversations that I've had with apartment building owners here in Denver, where they had owned and operated their own portfolio, or maybe ran a construction crew for a period of time before they ever invested in real estate. And in those two situations, someone who owned a building and managed it by themselves, but then also someone that ran with construction crews in this other example, both owners had said that not only walking the property with the manager, but then also making a point of walking the property at least once a month, if not bi-monthly, by themselves, just to kind of get eyes and ears on the property and just kind of look and see and observe how things are going. I think that's maybe another mistake that I see some of my own clients making, which is you hire a management company and everybody in our business talks about mailbox money, or that this is a passive investment. Operating commercial real estate, whether it's apartments or retail centers, industrial, et cetera, I mean, it needs to be looked after. And I think you probably appreciate it when your client, in a very gratifying way and not maybe in an annoying way, but they come to you and say, look, I was over at the property a week ago or a couple of days ago, and I noticed this and that. And I'd like to see if we can create a plan around fixing those items. And so I think it's a journey outside of just even that first initial walk through the property.
Yeah, I love that owners that will visit their property and understand what's going on, recognize some of the issues that you may see, as approach it, plans for it, if it's just something that is part of the asset. My background and my focus has always been asset preservation. If you have an asset that you plan to hold on, if it's generational, you really need to keep it up. And that's a really important thing. And if you're going to hand it off to your kids, you don't want to hand them a junky property when you pass. So it's really good if you can manage the cash flow, where some of it's going back into asset preservation, you're reserving some of it for improvements or repairs. That's always the best case scenario. I've had owners, and I don't love working with them, but I've had owners that just want to take all the cash. Just send it to me. We clear the bank accounts every month. There's no reserves. Things start coming up, deferred maintenance, and then you have to ask for a check. I never like asking an owner for a check. Like that's the last thing on my list that I will do. So if I can manage the cash flow where they're still getting, good monthly payments, and we still reserve some money for repairs, and I don't have to ever go to them for money, then I view that as a success.
That's a great point, and something that we probably should talk about quite literally. And everyone's going to have a different scenario for this, Peter. But if someone, it's just the topic of margin, right? If someone's draining the account every month or every quarter and saying, hey, I'm going to take all, and I could see pragmatically or maybe logically how that might make sense. Okay, as the owner, I'm going to take all the money out of the account. And so that sort of gives a governor. It sort of gives a stopgap of, if Peter and the team needs money, they'll ask me for it. But the problem is you don't know when those things are going to come up, and it creates maybe a logistical logjam or bottleneck when quite literally you have to do something over at the property and there are no funds that are there. So what's a good, healthy margin for what I call retained earnings? Some other management companies might call it reserves. What's a decent idea, whether it's per unit or just a percentage of maybe the gross operating income? What should people be keeping kind of in that rainy day fund, as a good example?
That really depends on the asset and what it is. If it's an apartment, if it's a retail center, if it's let's say it's a small residential asset, you want to keep enough for at least 1 month of rent for each unit, in my mind. That usually is a pretty good base reserve for the smaller residential assets. I have some owners that just say each month, keep $1,000, we'll build it up to 10, 20, $30,000 so that when a boiler goes out, we're prepared. It really, again, it really depends on the age, the class, and the size of the asset. But that's a conversation that you should have with the owner. Your manager should know what types of items that you may be looking at as potential failures or needed repairs or replacements. And that's, again, part of that interview with your manager is if they don't have that wherewithal to be able to explain, your property was built in the 70s. When we do a turn, we may have to do some remediation of asbestos or lead, and you need to be able to have that money on hand. So again, it's really asset dependent, and that's a conversation you should have. That's part of the defining expectations with your manager and your owner. How much can the owner or how much can the manager spend for maintenance without seeking approval from the owner? That's typically outlined in most management contracts, and it ranges. I have some owners that say anything over under 250 you have free reign. Well, that's a pretty low standard, but that again is smaller assets where the owner's really hands-on, and they need this money. It's not just mailbox money, that's what they're living off of. And some of those owners are a little bit more difficult to work with. However, all owners come in all shapes and sizes. So you have to be able to adjust your management agreement. You have to have systems in place where when you hit that maintenance limit that you have on the manager side, that you have some sort of mechanism that says, hey, you're at that limit, don't go above without getting approval. And most management software has that ability. Some doesn't. Some don't, and some, some people are managing in QuickBooks and Excel spreadsheets, and that's just, there's not enough tools in that toolbox to really manage properties well. So if you're an owner and you manage that way, that's great. But once you get into the property management business, you really need to have the tools to identify those limits.
Peter, it's such a great point. I'm glad you brought it up, because that's just a great life hack or just tip for success in life. I was in a personal finance money management class after my wife and I had been married a handful of years. And then I ended up teaching that class after we went through it. And it's a real good course. And one of the things they run you through is, hey, if either spouse wants to make a spending decision above a certain amount, like you can make it up based on your relationship, but that should be something that you go back to each other and consult with, maybe sleep on it for just a day, make sure that that's the right expenditure. And that's just a good budgeting tip. It's just, I think, a great way to look at it. And it gives the partner, and in this case, it's a manager and an investor or an owner, it gives you that free reign to make decisions and feel like you're not constantly constrained. And it also makes sure that the owner doesn't feel like it's just willy-nilly and this is going to be, wild spending spree on anything you want to do. And so I think that's a great tip for life. It's obviously a great business tip, whether you're operating an apartment building or you're operating your own small business. It's just a good idea to say, okay, what's that threshold of this expense comes in and it's not a regular, it's not a fixed expense that we're used to seeing all the time. At what point do we stop and say, we're going to consult someone else about this before we spend that? I think that's great. As far as expectation goes, what are some good expectations for how often you should communicate with your manager, Peter? When some of your best clients, I'm sure some of them will chat with you, once a week. Some of them will be once a month if they're in a big capital improvement project and they feel like they want to constantly be involved in what the flow of business is. But when things have been stabilized and when things are not in a big, unit turn or big capitalization type of phase, how often should someone be interacting with their management company?
Well, so once you're comfortable and things are operating, you have a feel for the way your manager operates and the owner's expectations. I'm about monthly with most of my owners. I send out my monthly statement with their check or their ACH, and there's usually a discussion within the following week or two Some owners take a little longer to, process the information that's sent. Some don't even look at it. They just get their check. They know it's there. They can, and with our system, we use the Appfolio. They have a portal, so they can go back and look at all their statements at any time, on their own, and they don't have to call us to send them information. But monthly is usually what most of my owners have gotten comfortable with. Some I don't talk to, but once a year. And then some other owners, depending on the market and what's going on, you may talk to them a lot more. With COVID, my workload and my communication load has gone up 40 to 60%. And it's mostly communicating. It's communicating with tenants, owners, lenders, and we're in a different world, obviously, but when you have to make on-the-fly decisions, how to manage tenants that aren't paying or can't pay or looking for payment plans, you're going to talk to the owner a lot more. Email is great, but inboxes get blown up right now. So the phone call, even if it's in a car, going to visit a property, you can knock out a lot of that conversation. But I would say monthly at a minimum is a really good standard for owners to be discussing what's going on at the property with their manager. If you get your report and everything looks great and it's clicking along and your budget comparison is right on, there's really no need. You get to a certain point where some managers will have an executive summary with their reports every month, but if there's really nothing to report, it's just wasted time. So, those often, at least for us, our executive summaries are just pushed out when there's something to discuss with the owner. And so your manager should be bringing things up to you. If you're, in a different state, that's really important. You want to have, some photographic inspections and an executive summary with your report to understand what's happening at the property.
Yeah, all great advice, Peter. And something I share with all of our brokers within our own company is that if you've got a listing, especially if it's a listing that's not moving as quickly as you'd like, or maybe as quickly as some people have come to expect with a heightened real estate sales market, you should be out there taking photos of the property, sending it to the owner. I like to say to a lot of my brokers that you need to justify your existence in that person's life. And they hired you for a reason. They want to know when you're on site. They want to know that someone's got eyes and ears on a property. And that could be a multifamily property that you're selling. It could also be a vacant house that someone may or may not be living nearby. And it's just nice to know that everything's secure, that the house is all locked up when you leave. And those are just great ways to communicate. It's soft communication. Obviously you can do, a quarterly summit or an annual summit to talk about budget projections. And we'll get into that in just a minute. But I think that some of the little things here and there, you probably drive by a lot of the properties that you manage on a regular basis and you're meeting different vendors. Those are just great, easy opportunities to let your client know that you're there and you're there for them. And it's a great way to extend communication. And so if someone's got a management company that isn't doing that, you're like, man, I'm not sure that I know when the last time they were on site at my property. That's a real problem. It's a real problem. And unfortunately, it's more common than most people would expect or think. So let's talk about budgeting long-term. We talked about some personal budgeting and maybe some thresholds, some ceilings of let's make sure to consult with the owner once you get to a certain spending limit on different things. But how often do you talk to your clients about the performance of the property? The way it looks, the aesthetic, obviously, what the rent roll is. And if you've got units that are coming available for rent, those would be things that you check in with them. But how often do you kind of take a step back and look at things from a more holistic point of view and just say, this is the projection that we had, this is the actual result, and make those course corrections for either the next quarter or the next half year or the next year? How often do you think people should be doing that with their management company?
Again, that really depends on your goal for the asset. At a minimum, you have your annual discussion, budgeting discussion, what capital expenses should be put into the budget, what projects should be expected, and what systems may be at the end of their useful life that you should expect to be replacing. That's the annual budget discussion. And when you have your monthly statements going out, some managers don't do monthly statements. I think that's at minimum what needs to be done. But I believe if you have your monthly statements, you're tracking along with what's going on. You can see what you've budgeted, what your plan has been, and if you are tracking, you get your year-to-date cash flow, and you can really see what your expectations were and where you're landing. And I think just having visibility eliminates the need for recurring meetings. But again, if it's a more high touch asset, you're going to obviously want to, speak monthly, quarterly, or semi-annually. But many of my assets have been long-term holds. They know what they have. We have our budget. We operate to the budget. And when we're outside of the budget, we have the discussion then. And then annually we'll send out the projected budget for the following year. And if they feel like we're not accomplishing their goals, then we have that discussion then.
That's great advice. And the next thing that I think about is maybe something that I'm going to assume that a few people on this that are listening in to this interview, to this podcast interview, I'm going to assume that there's a few people who have never really thought about apartment management. There's probably going to be several that listen in that have apartment assets. What are just some things to look for in types of buildings? You'll hear certain people talk about Class A, Class B, Class C buildings. You'll hear people talk about different type of vintages should be managed differently. A building that was built in the 80s gets managed differently because of the systems that were in place at that time of construction versus 50s construction. And so if you just kind of go high level, and I know most of this is going to be specific to Colorado, but just generally, what types of assets are there out there that you see in your portfolio and that you do really well with from a vintage standpoint, but then also just a construction standpoint? And what are some things that people should look for in each type of asset as it relates to the year that they were built?
Well, certainly that's a pretty broad question. I have a background in construction, and I look at assets a little bit differently than some. My first approach is I look at the envelope. Where are there spots in the building that water, air, insects, whatever, any point of infiltration. So you'll see a different architecture. You go around Denver and you see these brick buildings, and they're built incredibly well. You see the outside, the windows are still solid. You just check and see what the envelope of the building is. So regardless of the year of construction, you really just want to see how it was built. And if there's cracking or settling in different spots, you're going to have different issues with each type of building. And then, probably the most important infiltration point is a roof. So regardless of the age of the building, you want to know what that roof looks like. You don't want to buy an asset or jump into a management assignment without knowing what that looks like. If you have a leaking roof, you will have endless calls, and it will be a nightmare. And so that needs to be brought to the attention of the owner if they're not aware, and you really need to plan for replacement or significant repairs. And then, if we're going back to different years of buildings, you start going back a little bit farther, and you're on these boiler systems, and these are massive pieces of equipment, and they're expensive to replace. However, they last a really long time, and you can tell, has it been maintained? Has it been regularly inspected? And so just making sure that the systems that you have in place are in good working order, or you're planning for replacement and budgeting for that. I don't know if I really hit your point exactly what you were looking for, but
Actually, you answered it better than I would have thought. And the reason I say that is that you're right. Regardless of the vintage, you want to make sure that the asset's protected. And you've been talking a lot about asset preservation. And from a construction standpoint, where can water, air, insects get in? And, especially with a lot of these buildings that have flat roofs, is that flat roof, does it have a slope to it? Does it have crickets in the roof that get water away to the gutters or the scuppers? Is it concave, which a lot of roof systems, you walk up there and after a snowstorm and you start to get a little melt up there, it looks like it's a pool. So I think that's number one, is making sure that the asset is protected by figuring out how the building envelope is sealed. And it's great advice. I do agree with you that on different types of asset classes, you're going to have different types of systems, and not always is higher efficiency going to be a better solution, because as you had mentioned before, Peter, it kind of depends on what the owner's goals are. You might have a really big, expensive boiler system that's not as efficient, and people say, look, we're wasting money with energy costs. But if the cost of the upgrade on that boiler system is $30 or $40 or $50,000, same thing with a roof system. Roof may be a little bit more critical if you've got water coming in, but you might say we're going to schedule for near-term replacement or mid-term replacement over the course of several years, when that boiler might be inefficient, but it's not broken down. And I think I see that a lot with my clientele too. So it's, again, just that conversation that you might have with a management company.
Yeah, I think that there's really a lot of analysis that goes into that. I'm a lead accredited professional. I have a focus on energy efficiency as well. And everyone talks about, oh, you should just upgrade LED, put more efficient systems in. But as a manager and as a property owner, you also have to recognize the return on investment. And you get into a property where all the utilities are passed through to the tenants, the owner's not going to want to put the money in for an energy efficiency upgrade. So you have to balance that. You have to recognize, like, all right, I have a boiler that could be more efficient. What are the savings and what's the payback period for that investment? Or do I just ride this old hunk of metal out, as long as I can, and make the repairs as we go, and maybe not be as efficient, but I have a piece of equipment that's operable, and I'm not ready to replace it yet because it doesn't need it. Yes, I'm not as efficient. However, you have to recognize the balance of the investment and the return on that investment.
Peter, at one point during our interview, you had talked about the concept of legacy investments and where one generation might take over from the other, which is really a good fit for Calibrate, our real estate brokerage firm. Our mission is that we exist to help people create generational wealth through real estate. Now, our viewpoint on it is more through sales, acquisitions, or dispositions as one generation passes on to the next. The question that I have for you, and it's the last management question before we get to know the guy behind the management company, is, Peter, what do you see maybe the patriarch or the matriarch of a family? If you're working with a family office or just kind of a mom and pop investor, what are some of the good things that you see parents do for their children or their grandchildren as they're working through these legacy investments? And then maybe the negative inflection of where someone doesn't properly educate their kids on how the investment should work, and where things kind of get messy once it becomes multi-generational.
Well, I have all types of owners and generations that follow those owners. I really like to have, an owner that recognizes their asset and they're interested in the preservation of that asset, especially if they are going to hand it on to younger generations. One thing I would always say to many of your clients, if they do plan on passing on the asset, they make sure, if they have multiple children, that there's an operating agreement in place. I have multiple assets right now that were inherited, and they're cousins, second cousins, friends of the family. And they were probably done on handshake deals back when they were purchased. Now we have these aging assets, and there may be capital calls, or there may be a decision that the property should be sold or redeveloped, and there's no operating agreement. And that is near impossible to manage. So as an owner, think about, what's the next generation? Am I handing it down to cousins, relatives, just my children? Are there multiple children? Do the children get along? So having an operating agreement while cooler heads prevail is key to passing on that asset. And if you're an investor and you're going in with, a partner or a friend, have an operating agreement. Set it up right at the beginning so that you know what to happen, what's going to happen when stuff hits the fan, and how you're going to handle it. And so, as an owner that is going to pass on their asset to family, think about what you're handing off. Do you want to, come skidding across the finish line with the wheels falling off and then pass it off to your family to figure out what to do with it? Or do you want to have something well put together and just pass it off so that they have this asset that's really benefit to them, that's not a headache? Have your affairs in order when you pass. That's a key, a key thing to think about as you're getting up there in age. And if it is an asset that's maybe been neglected or has a lot of deferred maintenance, do you want to pass that asset off, or do you want to pass off the cash? So what, you really have to think about what you have, what's the next generation, who they are. Are they someone that's going to want to focus on it, or would they just want mailbox money? Because you could always sell out of a more difficult asset and place it into maybe a single tenant asset that you're just getting checks. And that brought us to a little bit to why have a manager. And if you don't want to deal with the headaches, you get to a point where you have enough units, enough properties that it's becoming a headache for you. You're getting calls on the weekend, whatnot. That's the time to get a manager.
I love all of that. And it reminds me of just some advice that I picked up along the way from one of my favorite thought leaders, a guy named Dave Ramsey. And Dave, when he was communicating to a small group of us in a lecture style conference that I was in, one of the things he reminded, and this was business owners, but also Dave owns a lot of real estate. He said, one of the things that the matriarch, mom or pop, as they're passing away, and we don't know when we're going to go, but he was making this quick little story of, it's almost like, mom or pop is falling into the grave and throwing the keys to the kingdom to their kids. And that's an inappropriate transfer of wealth where, you kind of say, look, I did all this, but I don't involve anybody in what my plans are, help them understand things. And that's a recipe for disaster. It's a made for TV fight, over reading over the will and all this. And it doesn't have to be that way. You can involve your children at different ages around the property. I've known plenty of clients that their kids' business was cleaning the laundry room and making sure that they collected the quarters and doing all that. And depending on your setup, maybe that works. Certainly cutting the grass. You can also have them sit in on some of these management meetings. It may bore them to tears, but it may cause some conversations to happen. And it ended out well. This is a great story though. One of the best scenarios that ended out well, but might not have, is I met over a decade ago with an elderly mother and her 4 adult daughters here in Colorado. And at one point during the discussion, we were talking about whether she should sell now or sell later when she passed on. And she made the comment, and it was very tongue in cheek. It was very well, it was very humorous, but she said, "I'll just let you guys all fight over it when I'm gone." And all the daughters were like, "Mom, you got to be kidding. We would never do that." And they actually worked really well together. But there's a lot of people that kind of mentally have that approach to the operation of their buildings. And they say, "Oh, the kids will just figure it out." And what ends up happening is if you don't make your intentions known, it's very difficult for your kids to know what to do. And oftentimes they would love to have that direction from you. It's a good piece of advice. All right, Peter, I've got a couple of questions for you here at the end. I always ask this to all of my guests. And the first question is just, how did you get into the real estate business? You mentioned you've got some construction experience. You've obviously got business acumen, but what caused you to want to get into the management part of the business and work with real estate owners and investors?
Well, I came out of college with the grand idea of opening, an outdoor resort and somewhere in the mountains, taking people hiking and backcountry skiing, and have a spa so part of the family can go to the spa. And so I went down that path for a while. I lived in the most incredible places, from Telluride, Colorado to Mendocino, California, and my last stint was in Tulum, Mexico. So I lived in these amazing places, and I was creating memories for families and vacations. And then I recognized I was on the wrong side of the desk, and I wanted to start creating those memories for myself and creating family. So That was around 2000. My father's he has a multifamily management and development company in Kansas City, and he said, "Hey, I have a new development. It's bigger than what I've done on my own. I need help." So I went back to Kansas City in 2000 with the intent of a 3-year development project. It didn't break ground for 5 years. I was able to do another development project within that 5 years. So I went back to help him with that, and then I got into his management business, and he said, "You need to learn this." And so I did everything from maintenance to working in the leasing office, then the director of maintenance, and overseeing large scale renovations, and to really nice ground up development. So I got a ton of experience, and during that time he even said, "You need to learn construction." So he pawned me off on one of our builders who was building duplexes, and I became a superintendent for them and learned much more about construction than I would have any other way. And I just got a ton of experience. And in 2007, I said, I really want to focus on energy efficiency and really learning more about real estate. And I came out to Denver for a master's in real estate and construction management, and graduated in 2008. Great time to come out with a master's in real estate and no money. Would have been great to have money and no masters, but that's not where I ended up. So I worked for the federal government in energy efficiency grants, and then I worked as the director of facilities for a local facilities management company here. So I just furthered my experience and knowledge of buildings and systems, and then in 2013 I broke off and started Denver Residential Services, high-end condos and homes, and I started picking up a fraternity house and different stuff. And within a year, I bought into Walpin and Company, which had sold. That's a really old Denver property management company. A guy I know bought the company and had business experience but no operational experience. So it was a good marriage, and merged that together. And we grew that 300% over 3 years, and then bought an even bigger company, Dunton Commercial. And it was totally different asset class. And we quickly realized that the big commercial assets, shopping centers and large office buildings, didn't merge with the smaller management assets that we had, smaller residential, smaller neighborhood retail. And so after a while there, I got bought out and took the old, the smaller asset portfolio and just started growing that. And that's how I got to where I am.
What a cool journey. And one of the core tenets or topics of the Calibrate Real Estate podcast is this idea that when we don't have things go the way that we necessarily thought they would, what do you do to iterate? What do you do to calibrate? And you mentioned you get a master's in real estate here in Denver and come right out in the middle of the recession, and you can't plan for that. You think that's the right thing to do, get more education. And it probably was the right thing to do as you look at things long term, but right there in the moment, you're like, what am I going to do here? And so I love that I hear in that answer, you're like, I'm going to figure out different ways to make things work. And it takes many steps to get to where you are today. So Peter, it's a good segue into our next question, which is this idea of Dear Younger Me. It comes from a song that I really enjoy that's on the radio that's got the same name, Dear Younger Me. And the author, the writer of the song, is writing themselves a letter now that they're older, when they were younger. And they're saying, here's some of the things that I learned through experience, through failure, through, falling down, sometimes on my face, sometimes on my back. If you've got someone that comes up to you in their early 20s, and I like to dub this question, the advice you wish you knew when you were 22, and they ask you, they say, Peter, I want to get into the real estate investment world. What should I do, or what advice would you give me? What do you typically say to someone in their early 20s that's interested in getting in this multifamily game or this real estate investing game?
Well, I would say find something you're good at and leverage your strength, and then develop an expertise. Progress over perfection. My business coach really preaches that, and I've really embraced that thought. So you make those 1% improvements each day, and if it's, hey, I want to be in real estate, I have no no expertise. How do I get to, how do I become that? Well, progress. You just pick up a Kyle Minotti podcast and listen to it, or there's a bunch of other resources out there, and learn bit by bit. Do what you can. Participate in any sort of deal that you can. But I say, find something you're good at, leverage those strengths, develop your expertise. And then after a while, you may find that you're bored or interested in something else, but with an expertise, you can often use that with a new twist or a bolt-on additional experience and pivot into a new position, a career or direction. Don't shy away from challenges or challenging paths. I mean, if you have the opportunity to take a harder class in school that you may not score as well on, take that class and learn it, and get that experience, because expertise is rare, and use it to your advantage.
Yeah, that's all great advice. And I'm kind of swimming, thinking about all the different things you just put the wisdom you just dispensed to us. It was great. I love the progress over perfection. Something my career coach a long time ago, a guy named Rory Vaden, who wrote a New York Times bestselling book called Take the Stairs, he would just say, done is better than perfect. And that doesn't give you an excuse to slack and not do a good job. It's not turn in, a C effort, but at the same point, if you don't turn in the paper, you're going to get a 0. So it's better to get it turned in and then learn from it and iterate. And if you didn't get the type of grade you wanted, or you didn't get the type of business result, the type of ROI, why? Look at it. Look for the seeds of learning throughout maybe some failure. It's tough. No one wants to dig through it and really figure out what went wrong, but that process of figuring things out is really important. I also love that you said, take the class that's difficult. I don't remember any of the simple, easy classes that I took in college, or just even post college, professional courses. I do remember the ones that are real grinders that really challenged me. And I might have been a little bit frustrated in the moment, might have said a curse word under my breath as I was studying for some of those things, but they mold you and they make you better, which is the important part.
Yeah. Responding to adversity, and that's it in any career, but specific, especially in real estate, how someone reacts when their back is against the wall is really a symbol of their character. And that's, again, back to how you pick a manager is honesty and integrity. You want to know what fees are being charged. You don't want to find out after the fact. And I've always been one of those people that there's no need to sneak a $50 here or there. Like, that does nothing for you. And think about $50 in the long run, and then are you honest and have integrity? It's just treat people right, listen, and I think those are huge things in any career.
It's wonderful advice. Great sage advice. Thank you, Peter. Last question actually is born out of the prior question. So I was asking another one of my career coaches, a guy named Chris Oakley, in episode 5 of our podcast, that question, the Dear Younger Me question, and his answer begot this new question that we ask. And this is in memory of Chris. Chris tragically passed away last year in a hunting accident. And his answer to the question was, he was in his 20s, and he had the blessing of being in a mentoring group where the facilitator of that group had everybody in the group read this book called The Principle of the Path by Andy Stanley. And in the book, Andy Stanley encourages his readers to write their own obituary. And this is sort of the think of the end in mind, which is a Stephen Covey maxim from 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So if you had to charge someone with doing your eulogy, someone that's really close to you, someone that would have to deliver a spoken eulogy, what were some of the things that you would hope that they would say, Peter, as they were recapping your life and talking about your life's purpose and your legacy?
I would hope that I'd be remembered as helpful, kind, honest, and caring. That's the kind of person I am, and I want to be remembered as. And I want to make people feel better about themselves, about their situation, and be there to help. We're in this together. We've heard that a lot. lately. We are, and what you put out, you get back tenfold. And if you're putting out, coal, you're not getting good things in return. And back to the progress over perfection. If you can make improvements to yourself and to those around you, you're just going to see dividends.
Peter, thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. Thanks for sharing the inside track to what makes real estate management successful, both for the owner and for the management company. If someone, especially here in Denver, or if they're in Colorado and they want to consult with you, see if they're a good fit for your brand of management and vice versa, how do they get connected with you? What are some of the best ways for someone to connect with you and set up a consultation?
You can go to my website, denvermgmt.com, denvermanagement.com. We're in the process of rebranding, but that will always be directed to our current website. They can email me directly, pkatz, so P-K-A-T-Z at DRSM, so Denver Residential Services Management, LLC.com.
Love it. Peter, thank you for taking the time to share with our audience. We are so appreciative of all of our guests. If you love this podcast, please, obviously, a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts is our number one priority. And if you have questions and want to connect with us about any sorts of questions, you can always drop us an email to info@calibratere.com. For Peter Katz, again, president of Denver Residential Services, Denver Commercial Management, I'm Kyle Malnati. I'd love to say thank you for our podcast producer, Kayla Davis, for booking this episode. And we will see you around the neighborhood. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks.